Thank you, Mary. I am going to, looking at the way we were asked to address this issue by Joe, it struck me as being maybe a little bit negative. So before I touch on what's wrong with politics in Ireland today, I think it's important to point out that what's right with it, not just in the current Dáil, but in our politics in general over the last couple of decades. And this is not that I think we should be complacent, but I think we need to face the facts, and the facts rather than allow people to give a distorted narrative of what politics is about. Because the danger of accepting the distorted narrative, the danger of the notion that everything is wrong with this country does breed the populists, it breeds the Trumps, Brexit, Le Pen in France. If the narrative is accepted that there is something radically wrong with our political system, I actually don't believe there is. And I think the constant abuse of mainstream politicians has really led us in the Western democratic world and in the European Union to a very difficult place at the moment. So first let me say that Ireland is not the basket case society that's often portrayed in the media. And in fact, some of our most prominent commentators describe us as a failed state at certain stages over the last few years, which is clearly just ridiculous. And in fact, if you look at the facts, Ireland is actually one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And the wealth is distributed in a reasonably good fashion. We can argue about how well it is redistributed. For instance, the UN Human Development Index, which actually barely ever makes a line in the Irish media, it measures the wealth of countries in the most comprehensive manner across a range of issues, from income per head, life expectancy, personal security, education. Ireland has been in the top 10 for the past decade and more, and our most recent ranking was 8th in the UN Development Index. And in his eye-opening book, Factfulness, the Swedish health expert Hans Rosling has a chart looking at all the countries of the world. He lists them in 4 stages of development based on just on 2 variables, income per head and life expectancy. And he has Ireland at the top level, at the top of the top level, in the top 4 or 5 countries in the world, like Luxembourg and Switzerland. That's something most Irish people actually wouldn't accept at all, I wouldn't believe. In an opinion poll a few years ago, conducted for the Irish Times, we asked a few questions to see what did people know about the political system, and we asked roughly where in the world, there were 180 countries of the world, did they think Ireland was. And the finding was the biggest number thought, the average, was about 35th to 40th. And that is not where we are at all. So how did this come about? How did we end up becoming a well-off, developed country? And you only have to talk to any of the people who have come here from Eastern Europe to get their perspective on Ireland to realise all the advantages that we do have. Because half a century ago, our population had fallen just to 2.8 million, and the figure is now about 4.7 million. We have had a huge surge of development, and I think we have to say that our political leaders and senior government officials have to be credited with undertaking policy changes that brought us to this position. And of course, membership of the EU was critical, but our so-called political elite led us into the EU. And since we joined the EU, the impact on our living standards has been phenomenal. When we joined, our Irish living standards are roughly half of those in the UK, and about 60% of those in the 6 of the existing European Economic Community states. We are now over 100%. We can argue again some of the technical details, but we are as well off as almost any other European country, an EU country. And I think the danger is that if we don't actually look at the facts and examine the facts carefully, we are in danger of demonising our system and ending up with all of the flaws and failures, and getting people like Trump or getting people like Boris Johnson who prey on people's fears, who inflate, portray things as being far worse than they are, and don't give credit to our politicians. So looking at the Dáil in general, I would say if you look at the House of Commons by comparison with the Dáil, it used to be a kind of widely accepted that MPs were far better educated than TDs, they spoke far better, they were better informed, and they had ministers of far higher calibre than our own. But just look at the House of Commons today. It's captured by the zealots of the left and right. A clear majority of MPs want a soft Brexit. or even to remain in the EU, but they're paralysed into submission by the Tory Brexiteers and the Corbynites of Labour. And I draw a contrast with that with what happened in our most recent election, which both Frank and Mary have alluded to, when it produced a hopelessly hung Dáil, when our traditional, no party was anywhere close to forming a majority. But the two traditional enemies, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, worked out a new way to make government possible. It's not the ideal way, and it does have many flaws. I wouldn't be quite as optimistic as Mary, but it does have some benefits. But the chief benefit is that it provided the country with a stable government, and a government which could deal with the big issues, the budget. Because if we don't have an economy that's ticking over, everything else falls to pieces. So Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael managed to come to an arrangement. They didn't do the coalition for, as Frank mentioned, Fianna Fáil, I think, believed that if they went into coalition with Fine Gael, the alternative would be Sinn Féin, and Fianna Fáil could see themselves being a Sinn Féin in opposition, becoming the party of government at a future election. But anyway, enough for the moment of giving politicians a bit of praise. I think that there isn't any great room for complacency either. And some of the trends that have developed during the confidence and supply period, I think, have the potential to undermine good government in the years ahead. I think one of the reasons it's worked reasonably well is because we're in an era of economic growth, of very, very strong economic growth. And because that growth is there, hard decisions are not really required by government. It's a question of TDs in the Dáil wanting more than they're getting, but more spending than they're getting. But there is enough spending. If we did have a serious economic crisis, and we could have the clouds on the horizon between Brexit or between a trade war instigated by Trump, things could be very difficult. And I would find it very difficult to see how the current arrangement could work in that kind of situation. Because one of a sign of things to come, I think, was the way the government was formed. The fact that the water charges were dropped, I felt was an appalling concession to the populist forces at the time. At that stage, when the government was formed, around 60% of people had been brought around, fairly reluctantly, because nobody likes paying more bills or extra taxes, but about 60% of people were in the system, and about another 20% would have had waivers of some kind or another. So you were down to about 20% of the population who couldn't pay or wouldn't pay. But Fianna Fáil insisted on the water charges being dropped as part of the confidence and supply arrangement, and I think that was a huge mistake. However, the confidence and supply arrangement has allowed the Dáil to implement 2 budgets and probably a third in this autumn. But the Legislative Assembly has not really worked. I mean, Mary is right. The TDs have a greater role if they mobilise themselves, if certain bills can be passed. But there are about 200 bills which have passed second stage. That means they've been accepted by the Dáil as legislation that needs to be refined. And a whole range of them are contradictory. Some of them are pretty far-fetched. There's a bill that would ban any further oil and gas exploration, passed by a majority in the Dáil. Legislative effect hasn't been given to it, and it won't be given to it. The government, I think, is slowing a lot of these bills down. They're supposed to have a money certificate to show that the money is there to pay for them, and they've been very slow to come up with these money certificates. And so there's a huge backlog of legislation, and most of it will just lapse when the 32nd Dáil is dissolved, with no great harm done. But I think the current system, it does give TDs greater power, but it also exposes them to more attacks from minorities, from small minorities. For instance, one of the big things we're not doing nothing about is climate change. And climate change is because there are a number of the independent TDs refuse to accept that there is a reason to do anything about it. The minister himself is in a quandary. For instance, John Fitzgerald, the economist who used to work for the SRI, writes a very good economics column in the Irish Times. He pointed out recently how the Eden Derry peat burning station was an absolute disaster in terms of our climate change commitments and should be shut down immediately if we are serious about climate change. He isn't saying there are 200 workers there. He said those 200 workers could be redeployed doing anything or even doing nothing, and it would cost the country far less, but it would also help us to meet our climate change targets, because it's one thing to talk about airy-fairy issues about what we might do in 10 years' time. This is an issue staring us in the face, and we're doing nothing about it. We also have the issue of wind power. Wind power, we're supposed to have alternative energy sources, yet all the populist politicians, the independents, all campaign against turbines. So the very people who denounce the government for not meeting our climate change targets are quite often the ones who are fomenting protests at local level. And again, talking to these, some of these issues can be developed by very, very small lobby groups who probably don't represent their communities, but TDs are terrified if 10 people get together, get a kind of a masthead, start talking to the local media, TDs start to panic, and inaction is the consequence. So I think that has been the downside of the competence and supply arrangements. It has been the kind of the inaction that has kind of paralysed decision making. You have, for instance, an issue of salmon farming. No new salmon farming has been developed. It is opposed on environmental grounds, which can be disputed. But if we look about 25, 30 years ago when salmon farming started, Norway was the pioneer. Norway, Scotland and Ireland were producing roughly the same, with Norway in the lead. But because of the objections to salmon farming in Ireland, we now produce something like 18,000 tonnes of farm salmon, much less than we did 20 years ago, where Norway produces over 1 million tonnes of farm salmon. And farmed fish in the future, the wild fish stocks cannot be sustained indefinitely. So farmed fish is the way we're all going to go. For instance, people in restaurants, the sea bass you order in a restaurant is farmed in Spain, in Galicia. And the salmon that we now have as smoked Irish salmon is imported from Norway, from Scotland and the Faroes. Meanwhile, there are coastal communities all along the west coast, all along in Donegal, which could actually benefit if salmon farming on a properly monitored basis was allowed to develop. But this won't happen because politicians will be intimidated by lobby groups who are opposed to it, and there'll be no serious analysis done of the actual rights and wrongs of the situation. So politicians have failed. Our government officials I've given credit for being very obviously part of the success story of modern Ireland, but there are issues there as well. A recent report into the Department of Justice into why the events surrounding why Frances Fitzgerald was forced to resign, and actually, in my opinion, Frances Fitzgerald, there was no actual reason for her resignation except pure politics. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't interfered in something she wasn't supposed to interfere with in the first place. But in the politics of the situation, Sinn Féin were going to put down a motion of confidence. Fianna Fáil rode in behind it. It meant Leo Varadkar faced a choice of having an election last Christmas or sacrificing the Taoiseach, and she had to go. But a report into all the issues surrounding her departure concluded that there's a complete lack of accountability in the Department of Justice, where ministers, Secretaries General of the Department, the Garda Commissioner, all had to resign or retire over issues not of their own making, and nobody could be found to be accountable for the decisions that were taken that forced them to resign. So that's that is something else. I'm running out of time, and I've to cover myself, I've written more than I need to say, but I will just get into a last issue, which I think most people in the media don't like to go into. Has the media a role in creating the negativity and in preventing or obstructing progress? And in this book that I spoke about, Hans Rosling was quite strong in the view that the media doesn't reflect the world that it is, not because it's any conspiracy theory or because they want to produce fake news, but because there is an audience for bad news, and there isn't much of an audience for good news. And emotional stories of individual problems always make a huge media impact, whereas general stories of progress and general stories about how we are a much healthier society than we were 20 years ago doesn't really cut it in terms of making a splash in the media. And one of the things I think the media need to do is to revert to the old-fashioned notion of a lot of journalists now think that their job is holding the government to account. Well, holding the government to account actually means you support the opposition all the time. I was talking to an old friend of mine and a great journalist, Joe Joyce, recently, and he said, journalists should forget about all this thing about holding institutions to account and report the facts. He said, facts are what it's about. And if the facts that you report expose scandal, as they will, then, of course, you'll have done your job. But it's not your job to go campaigning to bring down this institution or that institution. Anyway, coming to the point of the next election, I think Frank has given you a fair outline of where it's going to, of what the options are. My personal view is, I think he's right. On the polls, Fine Gael will be the biggest party, and Fianna Fáil will be the second biggest party. But the problem about another conference and supply arrangement is, I don't think Fianna Fáil can do it a second time. Having done it once, Micheál Martin will not be able to sell that to his party. So I think in that situation, the option is a Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael coalition, depending on the numbers. Or it's a Fianna Fáil or a Fine Gael going into coalition with Sinn Féin. Or if Fine Gael, I should say, the Varadkar effect continues and they do really well and get over 60 seats, and if Labour can manage to get up to 7 or 8 seats, which at this stage looks unlikely, but then again, I was talking to somebody earlier on who was talking to the PDs in their day when they had 4 and 5%. They managed in some elections to get 8 to 10 seats by targeting their support very carefully. A Fine Gael Labour coalition is possible, but basically we don't know what's going to happen. And again, I'll refer back to my conversation with Joe Joyce. Joe was saying the one thing a good journalist can do is tell you what has happened. Telling you what's going to happen, we're almost invariably wrong. So I'll leave you on that note. Thank you.